"The backyard is sort of interesting," said Mrs. Sweet William bravely, but they knew they were in trouble. Grandfather Sweet William had scheduled a visit. "Is that a dinner plate over there?" Grandfather Sweet William had taught Bud's dad everything he knew about order. He'd never understand Bud's garden. So they made sure that Bud kept his bedroom door closed, and they pulled the curtains over the windows that looked out on Bud's garden. Grandfather arrived with his usual presents: a classroom organizer for Bud and a bowl of silk flowers for Mrs. Sweet William. Silk flowers never drop their leaves. They are a wonder. After unpacking his silk robe and arranging his socks, Grandfather showed Bud how to organize his crayons. First by size, then by color. Finally labeled and placed in the box. He insisted on doing housework. "I have a special gift for finding dirt." Bud was on his best behavior. Grandfather was so busy he never went outside. The visit was going smoothly. Asparagus, bean, corn, ABC. Let's see, any soups that start with D? Until the storm came. Lightning flashed, thunder crashed, and hail pummeled the house. That night Bud lay in bed worrying about his garden. He had gotten it to look just the way he wanted. Everything was in order. Now the storm would mess it all up. Early the next morning, Bud raced out of bed before anyone else was up. It was worse than he imagined, and he began to cry. Grandfather heard the back door open and came out onto the patio. "Who made this?" "I did," said Bud. "You planted this garden?" Grandfather asked. "Yes," Bud sobbed, "and now everything's all messed up." Bud explained about the sunflowers, petunias, and zinnias, bellflowers, moonflowers, and geraniums, about kitchen scraps, compost piles, and how earthworms improved the soil. Grandfather Sweet William was impressed. "Your grandmother used to grow roses just like this." Mr. and Mrs. Sweet William woke up promptly at 8 o'clock. They heard voices outside. They remembered the storm. They thought about Bud's garden and about what Grandfather would say when he saw it. "Dad," Mr. Sweet William started saying before he got outside, "Dad, let me tell you a little something about this garden and the young man who planted—" Mr. and Mrs. Sweet William stopped in their tracks. Bud and Grandfather Sweet William were filthy, head to toe dirty, and both of them were having a time of it. "Dad?" asked Mr. Sweet William. "Are you feeling okay?" "Change is inevitable, son," laughed Grandfather, "except from a vending machine." The whole Sweet William family pitched in and put Bud's garden back in order. They straightened the sunflowers, petunias, and zinnias. They tidied the bellflowers, moonflowers, and geraniums. And Grandfather Sweet William replanted the rosebush. Later, after the garden was put back in shape and everyone had cleaned up, the Sweet William family sat down for lunch. "Hard work is easy to take," said Grandfather, "when you finish with chocolate cake," said Bud. Everyone laughed, especially Grandfather. What a great story. So, I'm going to remind us of our retail rope. And down here, there are different categories that we can talk about and remind ourselves with the retail rope about this story. So, I'm going to start with the first knot. Who are the characters in this story? You're right, it was Bud, and Mr. and Mrs. Sweetwater. And Grandfather Sweetwater. Okay? Now, where did the story take place? You're right, at the Sweetwater's house. Sweet Williams, excuse me. Now, which problem arose from this story? Bud was not as orderly as his family. You're right. So, my first three knots remind me of who's in the story, where the story took place, and what the main problem was in this story. So now when we're retelling the story, let's think about what happened first. You're right. Bud grew up loving dirt. So then what happened? He created a garden and Grandfather came to visit. And then what was the main thing that happened with after Grandfather came to visit? There was a storm. Okay? And then what happened? Yes, Grandfather found out about the garden. And how did our story end? And did we solve the problem? Yes, Grandfather loved the garden. And the Sweet Williams fixed it up. So, this circles back to our problem. And we notice that our problem was solved. And so using this rope, it can remind ourselves who was in the story, where the story took place, the problem, and how each of the events remind us back that the problem was solved.